palaces, the most spectacular and lavish homes on Earth. Luxuriously designed for the royals who wanted the biggest and the best. Behind the golden gates of these royal megastructures are incredible stories waiting to be discovered. Infamous monarchs from history, and the artists, designers, and engineers who turned their grand visions into a reality. These are the most opulent, flamboyant, and innovative royal residences around the world. In this episode, Hampton Court Palace has history coursing through the complex brickwork. Famous for being the home of King Henry VIII, the magnificent rooms played host to some of the most celebrated royals in England. Decisions that were made here changed the course of British history, making Hampton Court one of the world's greatest palaces. In the borough of Richmond-upon-Thames, just south of London, lies Hampton Court. Now a major tourist attraction, it began life as a Tudor palace before Sir Christopher Wren was commissioned to update it in 1689 to a European Baroque design. The two styles combined to create a truly unique royal residence. Tracy Borman is the Joint Chief Curator here.
I think Hampton Court is extraordinary for the atmosphere it has, and you certainly get that when you're walking around out of hours, when there are no visitors. You almost sense that you're walking back into a former age, particularly, I think, when you're in the heart of the Tudor palace. You almost expect to turn around and see Henry VIII standing staring at you.
Although Hampton Court is renowned for being the country retreat of many great kings and queens, most famously Henry VIII, the palace was initially the brainchild of the Archbishop of York, Thomas Wolsey.
Hampton Court began its life with Cardinal Wolsey. He was the chief minister under Henry VIII, and he was lowly born. He was just the son of a butcher, but he loved to project his splendour, the splendour of his new position. And so he wanted a palace to reflect that. And in 1515, he acquired the manor of Hampton Court and began building this amazing palace.
But the construction work would have been far from straightforward.
Some of the challenge is the ground. So it's quite variable, it's quite unpredictable because it's in a river valley. So the river has deposited all different types of materials. You get quite fine, silty clays. You get kind of gravels on top of it, which are slightly larger particles. And then you get a big, strong layer of sand below it. The depths of these things vary quite dramatically. So the engineers would have really had to understand what the makeup of the ground was before they basically went in and put this kind of big, heavy structure on top of it.
This would have been one of the largest buildings for several hundreds of miles. This is the size of churches, it's the size of cathedrals. It's over 5-storey building, and it's Wolsey really making a statement on the landscape here.
Despite not having an architectural or engineering background, Wolsey came up with the designs for the palace himself.
These days, when we talk about architecture, we talk about who designed it, who's the architect of this, who's the architect of that. But this doesn't make any sense in this early period. There was no designer, no architect. The client, in this case Cardinal Wolsey, would determine maybe what he wanted his building to look like, compared it to other buildings. And he'd have gone to a master mason, and they would have worked together to both to design the building, as Wolsey pointed out what he wanted, and actually build it.
Cardinal Wolsey was a man of exquisite taste, and he particularly liked Italian styles. So he brought in Italian artists, architects to help construct this incredible palace at Hampton Court. But you definitely get a sense of Wolsey's own personal stamp on it, and in particular, putting his name, his coat of arms, wherever he could. He wanted people to be aware this was very much his palace.
Parts of Wolsey's design were inspired by his religious background.
So one of the innovative things Wolsey does, taking a lead from the monastic architecture that he's been exposed to, is he adds this internal cloister all the way around the building. This means that rather than having individual access doors on the elevation that break up the flow of the windows, you can instead go through individual larger openings into the cloister and then into your own apartment. So this creates a much more formal and flat elevation. To do this, he's not only creating that corridor, but he's burying the fireplaces and the guardrobes on the interior of the property.
Cloisters typically are covered walkways that lead to the outside, to the atriums or to the open-air gardens that you see in these large palaces. But what he did was to actually put them inside the palace. And the reason I think he did that was because he wanted to stop the warmer air from rising too rapidly up into the high ceiling portions of the palace. So by having these kind of internal covered walkways, he basically restricted airflow. And so when people walked underneath it, they had a little pocket of nice warm air that they could walk in, which made it a much more comfortable experience.
One of the standout features of Wolsey's original palace is the incredible brickwork.
Hampton Court is almost your classic Tudor building. So in the materials particularly that you're seeing here, you're seeing the archetype of Tudor building in the 1520s. You have these small, thin red bricks, the lime mortar, the detailing picked out in stone. Here you can actually see evidence of the diaper work that's expressed in the building. Now these are a mix of vitrified bricks, so bricks that have been overburnt in the kiln and have turned black, that are used to create these wonderful artistic patterns on the brickwork. There has been lots of historical debate about whether this is doing something structural or whether it's a way that the bricklayers work out where they're at or sort of mark progress in some way. I think it's probably just pretty.
In some ways, construction in the 15th, 16th century was very similar to today and would have been recognisable in the same way that modern bricklayers lay every brick by hand. Bricklayers in the 15th and 16th century laid every brick by hand. They weren't using modern cement, but they were using lime mortars, which looks very much the same.
Wolsey was very much King Henry VIII's right-hand man. But just as the Catholic Cardinal was putting the finishing touches to his magnificent home, the king was being influenced by a new religious movement sweeping across Europe.
The Protestant Reformation is kicked off by a German friar named Martin Luther, who makes a protest against the fundraising techniques being used by his local archbishop in 1517. So this, to begin with, just looks like a local academic spat. But for him, there's some deeper principles at stake underneath this. Almost by accident, within a few years, before anybody has quite realized what's going on, this little local dispute has blown up into a continent-wide division.
When Luther's new Protestant movement reached England, the Catholic Church did its best to stamp it out.
And it looks as if that's how it would end, until in 1527, Henry VIII stumbles into an argument with the papacy. He wants his marriage to Catherine of Aragon to be annulled so that he can remarry, which leads him on to thinking, well, what power does this Pope have over England anyway? Why should I, God's anointed King of England, listen to what this Italian bishop has to say? And by around 1529, he's really moved on from looking at this as a quarrel about his marriage to thinking that this is something much more fundamental. It's about his own authority.
The woman who had accelerated Henry's need for an annulment of his first marriage was a member of his court named Anne Boleyn.
Henry's courtship with Anne Boleyn took place here at Hampton Court, and I get the sense that Anne must have had her eye on the palace. She certainly had her eye on the prize of being queen. She refused to be Henry's mistress. She held out for the much greater prospect of being his wife.
Henry turned to his right-hand man to find a way out of the predicament.
Wolsey is one of the first people to be consumed by Henry's quarrel with the Pope. Wolsey is effectively given the brief when this dispute first blows up: find a way of resolving the marriage, which is difficult, but Wolsey's a formidable operator, and had he been left to do it on his own, well, he probably had a better chance of extracting a favorable result from Rome than anybody else would have done.
But Wolsey didn't really try very hard for once, because he didn't like Anne. He didn't think that she would last. He thought Henry would soon go on to the next woman. But of course, he was wrong. For once, this very clever statesman gravely miscalculated, and it would be his downfall.
In 1529, by way of punishment for failing to get the annulment he so badly wanted, Henry turned on Wolsey.
He strips him of many of his offices and his properties, and in particular of Hampton Court Palace. There had been whispers about how it was grander than any of the royal palaces during the 1520s, which could have been calculated to get Henry's goat. And so Hampton Court, as with much of the rest of Wolsey's establishment, moved sideways from being the Cardinal's palace to being the king's.
Wolsey, you might say, had a lucky escape, because Henry had decided at last to decisively act against him, to have him tried for treason. So he summoned Wolsey down from York, but actually by then Wolsey was a very sick man, and he only made it halfway down to London, and he died of natural causes.
Henry went against Rome and married Anne Boleyn in January 1533. It was a monumental decision that was made within the four walls of Hampton Court Palace.
Hampton Court played a pivotal role in Henry VIII's Reformation, because it's from here that Henry first put pen to paper. He wrote a letter with some instruction or some decision about breaking from Rome, breaking from the Pope, and that letter was signed here at Hampton Court. I think it's hard to see a more significant moment in this nation's history than when Henry broke from Rome, when he established his own Church of England and made himself, as sovereign, head of that church.
During his disagreements with Rome, Henry VIII had begun to turn Hampton Court into a palace fit for a king.
In typical Henry VIII style, what do you do when you inherit a palace bigger than any other in the kingdom? You extend it. And so he builds the Great Hall. He extends his own apartments, those of Anne Boleyn, and he tries to eradicate any trace of his old favourite, Cardinal Wolsey.
A huge team of masons, carpenters, and bricklayers built the Great Hall for Henry. Measuring 106 feet long, 40 feet wide, and 60 feet tall, it is by far the biggest room in the palace.
So this is Henry VIII's Great Hall, his showpiece, really, of the whole palace. And what you have to imagine is the colour and the gold and the jewels that would have sparkled all over this magnificent space. Here at the top of the room, we have the raised dais, which is where the king and his family would have sat on great occasions. And then the rest of the court, up to 1,000, would have been seated along the rest of the hall.
To create that open space, there was a really clever technique used to create the roof. You know, if you go in there today and you look up, it's absolutely beautiful, but from an engineering point of view as well, it's really innovative.
If you're going to make a very big room, the problem is how to span it, how to go from one wall to the other with a roof. And in this period, the solution was to make huge exposed arch-braced or hammer beams roof trusses, which are very dramatic structures.
So starting from the walls, we have a slightly morbid term, gallows brackets. They look like a hangman's frame, really. So it's a triangle shape with a diagonal across it. And that's a nice strong shape. So you've now attached those to the walls, and now you've got a slightly shorter span that you need to work with. Then on top of that, you can create arches and different shapes with these wooden beams in order to create this amazing roof over this very, very long span.
The hammer beams are an opportunity for decoration. So one looks up and sees this magnificent timber roof above, which is very tall. But most importantly, it gave a space for the smoke to escape, because these halls were typically heated by braziers or fires, which produce lots of smoke.
It was a dazzling showpiece, really. This is Henry VIII making a great statement about how magnificent his new palace is.
Hampton Court almost immediately became a bustling, busy palace. And it really is, and was, Henry VIII Wonderland. It's Henry VIII Disneyland, because everything is about Henry VIII there. It's a big palace all about him. And within 6 months, major rebuilding of Hampton Court had started, essentially because Henry VIII had this gigantic court. So one of the first things Henry did was to start expanding the kitchens, because those 1,000 people in his court have to be fed.
Henry's kitchens were the largest in England and employed 200 cooks who had to produce over 800 meals every day. For more than 200 years, different kings and queens dined on food prepared in here, right up until 1737. Still in working condition today, the 36,000 square foot kitchens are managed by Richard Fitch.
You can see these arched entrances, 2 on this side, 1 on the other side of the building, and then 3 further fireplaces as we would move down through towards the end. Each one of the large fireplaces has the capacity to roast enough meat for 400 people in, so it gives you an indication of this excess capacity that's built into the space for working. And if we look right the way up to the top, it's about 11 metres all the way up to the apex of the roof. It's part of the air conditioning to try and move the heat from this ground level where it would be really unpleasant to work and try and shift it out through the roof out into the rest of the world.
1.3 million logs per year would have been used in the kitchen's ovens. The fires here would have been burning almost constantly to cook for the 1,000 courtiers who worked for the king.
So the king at the top gets 2 14-dish courses per meal. The people right at the very bottom get 1 course that contains 2 selections of beef, some bread and some beer. But it's still more than normal people in the rest of the Tudor world would be getting. The whole point of the meal isn't sustenance, it's to show the power of the monarch and the value that he puts on his staff.
This was a busy, hard-drinking, hard-eating, hard-working palace. And if you were a Tudor of influence and power, that's where you wanted to be. You wanted to be at Hampton Court.
Work continued throughout the palace as Henry turned Hampton Court into one of the most magnificent royal residences in Europe. But by 1536, it became clear that Queen Anne Boleyn would not live to see the renovations.
Even before Henry had married Anne Boleyn, he started rebuilding the apartments here for her so that they would be ready for when she was his wife and she could live in splendour. Well, in fact, poor old Anne didn't quite live to see their completion. She's known as Anne of 1,000 Days. She was queen for less than 3 years. And then she went to the block, the first of Henry's wives to be executed.
Found guilty of adultery, incest, and treason, Anne was beheaded at the Tower of London on the 19th of May, 1536. But her memory lives on at Hampton Court.
One of the things I love most about the Great Hall is that you see the personalities come through. It's not just about the grand architecture and the great events. And probably my favourite feature in the whole of the Great Hall is something you could easily miss. It's in that central panel there. In the top right-hand corner, you might just make out an intertwined H and A. Now that stands for Henry VIII, and Anne Boleyn, his second wife. That shouldn't be there at all, because Henry always decorated his palaces to reflect the latest wife, but once she'd gone, her initials were replaced with the new wife. But obviously, his overworked carpenters managed to miss one.
The day after the execution of Anne Boleyn, Henry married for a third time, but the new Queen's apartments remained incomplete.
So he does start the new apartments for Anne Boleyn, but it takes such a while to complete them. By the time they are finished, she's lost her head, and they are taken over by his next queen, Jane Seymour, and this is where Edward VI is born.
Henry had been desperate for a male heir since his first marriage in 1509, and now, 28 years later, his dynasty was finally secured.
You might imagine Henry VIII rides over here when he hears the news. He is transported with joy. At last he has a son. But that joy soon turns to grief, because Jane Seymour has contracted an infection after the birth, and she dies just a few days later.
Henry was devastated. The woman who had finally bestowed a son upon him was gone. The grieving king became increasingly paranoid and wary of those around him.
A rather hidden feature of the Great Hall, you really have to look carefully for them, are up in the ceiling. Tiny little faces peering down at us from the eaves, and they are eavesdroppers. That's where the word comes from. These little faces were to remind the courtiers sitting below that everything they said was heard by the king.
He was given all kinds of information there. He was told many things there, and many great acts of Henry VIII's reign took place in Hampton Court. So when you go there, it's almost like you can hear them. You can hear these voices discussing, talking, wondering, asking. It is the place where if you go, you feel closest to Henry VIII.
Throughout his life, Henry continued to improve Hampton Court, adding an astronomical clock in 1540. Designed by Bavarian mathematician Nicholas Kratzer and built by clockmaker Nicholas Orsian, it is over 9 feet in diameter and overlooks the inner court at Hampton.
This clock is also a technological marvel. This is your iPhone of the 16th century. Not only is it telling you the minute, the hour, the day since the start of the year, the sign of the zodiac. It's also giving you crucial information, just like you might get on your app today, which is the high tide at the Thames. So if you're traveling between royal palaces in the 16th century, as Henry did frequently, one of the crucial things you need to know is the tides, because the Thames at this stage isn't embanked. It's actually very dangerous in places. There are rapids, there's very fast-moving water, and so if you're going to leave here and arrive safely in Whitehall, you need to know the time of the Thames, and this clock tells you that.
Henry VIII married 6 times during his 38 years on the English throne, and he will forever be linked to Hampton Court.
Henry died in January 1547, and it was rather a sad ending to what had been a glorious reign. By then, Henry was plagued by ill health, by an ulcerated leg caused by an old jousting injury. He had gained a colossal amount of weight. He was such a far cry from the Adonis that he was described as being when he first came to the throne.
After Henry died, Hampton Court passed to his son, Edward VI. But Edward VI didn't use the court an awful lot. He tended to be in London rather more because he was much more focused on the religious Reformation, and he was less interested in hunting, in feasting. He was a much more serious boy king. So Hampton Court, to a degree, fell into a little bit of a quiet period, I think we might say, under Edward VI.
Henry VIII's son, Edward VI, spent much of his short life establishing the Church of England. But after 6 years as king, the lack of an heir caused a major problem.
King Edward dies of tuberculosis at the age of 15. He tries to fix the succession in favor of his Protestant cousin, Jane Grey, before he dies. It's a rather badly thought out and certainly a badly executed plan, and the upshot is that the crown passes very quickly instead not to his Protestant cousin but to his Catholic sister, who becomes Queen Mary I, who rapidly undoes everything that her father and brother had done, restores Catholic obedience, and she then enforces that vigorously. Something like 300 people are executed for their refusal to conform to her new settlement.
The new Catholic queen needed an heir to her throne if she was going to keep her Protestant sister Elizabeth from succeeding her.
The most tragic thing about Mary is something that was played out here at Hampton Court, and that was her desperation to have a child. She believed herself very soon in her marriage to be pregnant, and she displayed the signs of that. Her stomach started to swell, she was nauseous. She came here for the birth, when by then she thought she was in her 8th month. And in fact, it turned out to be nothing more than a phantom pregnancy. So poor Mary was eventually forced to admit that it had all been for nothing.
So this tragedy was not only a personal tragedy for Mary, the phantom pregnancy, also it was very painful for her because if she didn't have a child, then Elizabeth, the Protestant, would take the throne and all Mary's Catholic hard work of Reformation would be undone.
In November 1558, the inevitable occurred.
Mary dies after being queen for just 5 years, and somewhat against her will, she's obliged to leave her throne to her half-sister Elizabeth, but everybody else rejoices at Elizabeth's accession. She's much more popular than her elder sister. She looks every inch the Tudor princess with her flame red hair, and she has that same charisma that her father Henry VIII had enjoyed.
Elizabeth I, daughter of Anne Boleyn, was Queen of England for almost 45 years, but rarely visited her father's palace. It wasn't until the turn of the 17th century that Hampton Court came back to life.
With the death of Elizabeth in 1603, the Tudor dynasty also died out. She was, of course, the Virgin Queen. She had no children, so the throne passed to the closest relative, James VI of Scotland, James Stuart. It's the beginning of the Stuart era here in England. And it was very clear from the start that James was of a very different mould to his Tudor predecessors. There were masques, plays, entertainments, often descended into drunkenness and debauchery, so it was quite shocking after the Tudor court. But one of the most famous entertainments here in the Great Hall was a performance by none other than Shakespeare and the King's Men, the players of his troupe, and they performed various plays in the Great Hall, including Macbeth in 1604 or thereabouts. And it's just amazing to imagine the hall thronged with courtiers, Shakespeare himself performing right here where I'm standing in front of the new king.
After a 22-year reign, James I died in 1625. His successor at Hampton Court was his son, Charles.
Things soon went very wrong for Charles I. His relationship with Parliament was very fractious, in the end culminating in civil war. And having been here as a king, Charles I ended up here as a captive, a prisoner of Oliver Cromwell and the parliamentarians.
After the Civil War, Oliver Cromwell became Lord Protector of the Commonwealth. But despite his part in crushing the monarchy, Cromwell very much played the role of king at Hampton Court Palace.
Although playing a very bloody part in the Civil War, Oliver Cromwell can actually be seen as a saviour of Hampton Court Palace. So at the time that Parliament takes over the palace, their first plan is to knock it all down and sell it off for scrap. Very luckily, Oliver Cromwell has visited the palace, he's visited Charles as he was a prisoner here, and he really likes it. So eventually a deal is worked out between him and Parliament, and a sort of trade happens with one of Cromwell's properties being traded, and he takes control and sort of ownership of Hampton Court and starts using the palace as his family retreat, his sort of weekend country pad.
In 1660, the restoration of the monarchy saw Charles II crowned King of England. But his hedonistic lifestyle at Hampton Court eventually led to another threat to his Protestant country.
Charles II has no legitimate children. He has plenty of illegitimate children, but none who are able to succeed him. So his heir is his brother, James, the Duke of York. And James, in the 1670s, converts openly to Catholicism. So suddenly, Protestant England is faced again with the existential threat of a Catholic succeeding to the English throne. And so finally, when Charles dies in 1685, the crown does indeed pass to his brother, who becomes King James II, and England once again has a Catholic monarch. Once his son is born in 1688, then the possibility arises that this won't simply be a short-lived Catholic interlude that will die with him, but will instead be a permanent Catholic dynasty. And that, more than anything else, is what precipitates the plotters and grumblers to mobilize a couple of Stuart relatives, Mary and her husband, William of Orange, the stadtholder of the Dutch Republic, who's half English.
In what has since been dubbed the Glorious Revolution, King William III and Queen Mary II took the throne in 1689. The new monarchs enjoyed the country air at Hampton Court and had plans to renovate the 170-year-old palace.
William and Mary had incredibly ambitious plans for Hampton Court. They commissioned their favourite architect, Sir Christopher Wren, to get to work, and his original design envisaged destroying the entire Tudor palace, keeping only the Great Hall as some kind of relic to be used still for entertainments.
Luckily for us, as a 21st century audience, but not so much the people of Europe at the time, William is spending most of his money fighting people, and so doesn't have the funds to support Wren's grand plan. The plan is boiled down into one large courtyard in Hampton Court, and also some clever architectural tricks like this colonnade used to disguise the fact that most of the palace is still a couple of hundred years old. This colonnade is one of the finest expressions of that English Baroque style.
So now, as you approach Hampton Court, on the west front it looks like you're entering a Tudor palace. On the east front, it looks like a Baroque one.
The new-look palace was inspired by a design that was popular across all of Europe.
What we now call the Baroque style, which they wouldn't have used that word at the time of William and Mary, it was just thought as classical architecture. Its roots are really in Italy, and more importantly, that its roots are in ancient Rome. And they were looking to the architects of Italy, who got their inspiration from the ruins of ancient Rome and archaeological digs that were happening at the early 17th century, and books were being circulated around Europe about this style.
Wren used an ingenious way of building the new wing.
Wren produced a structure which had never been seen before. It's one where the roof trusses, which span over a long distance, are then used to support lots of rooms in the floor below, and to support those small rooms, he had iron rods coming down from the roof trusses, suspending the floors. This would be completely impossible in any other material, and it was complete innovation which is never copied, in fact only rediscovered in the 20th century, when a fire burnt out those rooms and the rods were revealed.
The Baroque style was a very self-confident style of architecture, a very magnificent, highly decorative kind of design, and it really helped to express the national identity of Great Britain at this time. William and Mary with a new hope of the nation, and that was played out in this very grand style of architecture that they loved so much.
But in December 1694, the 32-year-old Queen succumbed to smallpox.
Very sadly, Mary dies before she really gets to enjoy the palace. So the main structure is built, but by the time of her death, none of the interiors have been fitted out. They haven't even spent a single night here, and she doesn't really get to see the end of the project that she's really been driving forward.
The 66-acre gardens at Hampton Court are a testament to William and Mary's passion for the palace. Terry Goff is the member of a very historic and exclusive group.
Well, there's around 17 head gardeners, and I have a board by my office with all their names on it, and mine's the last one. What that tells me is that really I'm standing on the shoulders of giants, and that a job like this is a contribution of many people's efforts over many, many years.
Garden designer George London and his apprentice Henry Wise were in charge of the grounds at Hampton Court at the turn of the 18th century.
Well, we're actually in the restored King William III's privy garden, and privy garden meant private garden. And there is a very interesting story. When the gardeners of the time, George London and Henry Wise, finished this garden, they were standing on the first floor of the King's apartments with the King, all excited because the garden was finished. And the King is said to have said, "I cannot see the river." And that resulted in poor old George London and Henry Wise having to lower this end of the garden by 8 feet. In the days when it was all handwork with wheelbarrows, no JCBs or mechanical aids in those days.
But William III didn't get to enjoy the view for long. He died in 1702, almost 8 years after his wife Mary.
So this probably would have been one of the last things that William III saw before he died. He actually died in a home park, or the house park, which adjoins the gardens here. He was hunting and he fell off his horse. His horse was called Sorrel, and he broke his collarbone and he died of those complications.
When he and Mary don't have children, then the crown passes to Queen Anne. She has a great many children, all of whom predecease her. When she dies childless, then they've run out of Stuarts, apart from James II's Catholic family in exile. But rather than go to those legitimate English rulers who are Catholics, England's political establishment turns to a German royal family, the descendants of James I's daughter, Elizabeth. So when King George I is brought over, the decision at that stage has been made that they would rather have a German king who speaks no English than risk bringing in a Catholic. And the Act of Settlement that's passed in 1701, which is still in force, precludes any Roman Catholic from holding the English throne.
The new Royal House of Hanover used Hampton Court as a place to relax. King George II made changes to the palace that were inspired by the Tudors some 200 years previously.
So our architectural journey now takes us to a building that, on the face of it, you might be forgiven for thinking is original Tudor, but is in fact a 1730s building, and this is the Cumberland Range, built by William Kent, a very famous, very fashionable 18th century architect, for the Duke of Cumberland, who is George II's favourite son. What George II creates for him here at Hampton Court is one of the first neo-Gothic buildings in the country.
The Cumberland Range would be the final amendment to Hampton Court.
Hampton Court suited those who preferred the quiet life and the cleaner air, but not all monarchs did. They often liked to be more central, closer to the heart of power. So Hampton Court, I'm afraid, simply fell out of fashion.
George III then makes the decision to stop bringing the court to Hampton Court. So in 1737, the doors are closed, the state apartments are locked up, and the court as a formal body, so the king being in residence here, never happens again after that point.
Although George III never stepped foot in the palace, he did commission the grapevine.
This is the famous Hampton Court grapevine that was planted in 1768 by Lancelot Capability Brown, the great gardener of that period. And here it is, 251 years later, it's still embellishing this wonderful greenhouse. This is a huge find, and it all derives from that very old gnarled stem in the corner, which is a girth of 3.8 metres. And the longest rod, we call these branches rods when we're referring to grapes, is a staggering 33 metres long. So that makes it the largest grapevine in the world.
Almost exactly 100 years after George III had abandoned Hampton Court Palace, Britain's newest monarch found a use for it.
Queen Victoria opened the doors of Hampton Court to the nation in 1838, just a year after becoming Queen. Well, there was huge interest and visitor numbers rose at a staggering rate. In the first few years alone, Hampton Court received no fewer than 10 million visitors. It became the #1 tourist attraction.
So really, Victoria begins this idea of going out to a beautiful palace at the weekend, and the Victorians were absolutely thrilled. They loved the idea that they could walk around this incredible place where so many kings, so many queens had lived, so much history took place.
One of the star attractions at Hampton was the maze that dates back to the time of William and Mary.
So this is the famous Hampton Court Maze, which is the oldest hedge-planted maze in the world. It was actually planted in 1690 by the famous gardeners George London and Henry Wise.
Designing a maze might seem difficult, but actually it's relatively straightforward. You start off with a drawing of the maze, and then one has to lay it out on the ground with pegs and string, exactly as one would lay out the foundations of a building. And then, of course, one has to plant the hedges, and then one has to wait.
It wasn't a symbolic maze, it was a maze designed for entertainment. And the entertainment was, you found your way to the centre or the goal of the maze, and then you navigated your way out again. So let's have a wander through now, and let's go straight to the goal of the maze.
The trapezoid-shaped maze covers half an acre with a total path length of over 2,500 feet. It takes, on average, 20 minutes to navigate to the center. Conquering this labyrinth is no mean feat.
And here we are, the goal or the centre of the maze. I think that element of getting lost and finding your way out and navigating your way around this great puzzle maze is as popular today as it was 300 years ago. So that element has, I think, stood the test of time really, really well.
The palace and its grounds remain open to the public and attract over 1 million visitors every year, each one hoping to learn more about the beauty and intrigue of Henry VIII's magnificent home.
You can step through the front door and be in the 16th century, be in Henry's world. And by the time you're exiting into the gardens, you're in the 18th century with William and Mary looking at an incredible Baroque landscape. And we can take you on that journey through the palace, connecting to these crucial moments in British history. And that's what really creates the magic for me.
So many of our great Tudor palaces, Tudor aristocratic homes, they've all been lost. And Henry VIII survives, Hampton Court survives, and gives us such an incredible insight into Henry VIII, the man and the monarch.
As a Tudor historian, you don't get any better than this. It's the greatest surviving Tudor palace in the world. But it's the atmosphere that makes it so special. You really do feel like you're stepping back into centuries of history.